The film begins with a young girl named Ellen Hutter experiencing a tense moment as she summons and makes a pact with an evil demonic entity far beyond her control, named Nosferatu. Once the ritual is complete, the demonic vampire entity has sexual intercourse with her before eventually choking her by the throat, thereby completing the possession. Suddenly, the scene shifts, revealing that it was all just a dream. Her husband, Thomas, quickly notices her distress and seeks to know what's wrong. Afterward, he hugs her passionately, comforting her and assuring her that there's nothing to be afraid of. However, he soon realizes he is running out of time, so he says his goodbye and heads out for work. Ellen, still unsettled by the nightmare, reminisces about what she had just experienced. The year is 1838, in Alamein. Meanwhile, Thomas, in a hurry, sets out to meet a man named Nock Mapler. Upon reaching his destination, he apologizes for arriving late, but Nock instead congratulates him on his recent marriage. Without wasting time, Nock discusses business. He informs Thomas that he wants him to strike an eccentric deal with an old count who wishes to acquire a home in Weiser. Aiming for financial security, Thomas readily accepts the deal to sell a rickety stately home in Wisborg to the reclusive and eccentric Count Warlock. Later that day, Thomas returns home and quickly informs his wife about his journey. The moment she hears this, she warns him not to go, confessing that before their wedding, she had a horrific nightmare in which she married death itself, with only dead boys in attendance. However, the most unsettling part was that, despite the horror, she found herself enjoying the entire process. Yet again, Thomas reassures her, insisting that he must go because this is his only chance to secure a promotion at work. The next day, he takes Ellen to stay at the home of his wealthy friend, Friedrich Harding, until his return. He again reassures her that the nightmare was just a dream and that there's nothing to fear. They share a special moment together that night. However, Ellen's nightmare continues to haunt her, and soon, Nosferatu consolidates the pact she made with him. The following morning, Thomas prepares for his journey. Before he leaves, Ellen gives him her necklace, unaware that she had cut her hair the night before and placed it inside. This unknowingly fulfills one of Neritu's ultimate requirements. After a long journey, Thomas arrives in Transylvania, where the townspeople welcome him with open arms. He is pleased and happy with their cheerful demeanor, until they suddenly begin laughing in a strange and eerie manner. Moments later, the town chief steps outside and scolds the locals for their inappropriate behavior. The chief is skeptical about Thomas staying due to his association with Count Warlock, but after some pleading and a bribe, Thomas convinces him to let him spend one night there. That same night, an old woman gives him a cross, insisting that he will need it soon enough. Moments later, Thomas witnesses the townspeople performing a ritual before stabbing what they claim to be a vampire's corpse with an iron stake. The next morning, Thomas woke up still terrified by the events of the previous night. However, he chose to ignore his fears and continued his journey to the castle. As he proceeded, he noticed a mysterious carriage approaching him. Strangely, it stopped without anyone driving it. Despite the eerie sight, Thomas gathered his courage and boarded the carriage, which then took off, racing toward the Count's mansion with wolves running behind it. Upon arrival, Thomas was received by the impatient and horrendous Count Orlok. A voice informed him that he was late, and Orlok insisted they dine together while finalizing the purchase of Schloss Grunor immediately. As they sat down, Thomas was offered a glass of wine. However, when he attempted to question the unsettling rumors he had heard, Orlok dismissed them as mere superstition and urged him to eat. As Thomas dined, he accidentally cut his thumb, causing it to bleed. Orlok, instantly drawn to the scent of blood, fixated on the wound. At this moment, Thomas began to sense that something was terribly wrong. Unfortunately, his realization came too late. Orlok revealed his true nature and attacked him. Meanwhile, Ellen desperately tried to convince Anna that a great danger was coming, but Anna dismissed her fears, believing they were all in her head. Back at the castle, Thomas, now unconscious, had a strange dream. In this unconscious state, Orlok made him sign a mysterious document written in an occult script. Moments later, the Count retrieved Thomas's locket and took out Ellen's hair, which had been hidden inside. Satisfied, Orlok then presented Thomas with a chest of gold coins as payment for his services. Unfortunately, once Thomas signed the document, he requested to leave, believing the deal was complete. However, Orlok coldly informed him that returning home was no longer an option. He had to stay, whether he liked it or not. As Thomas regained consciousness, he noticed vampire bite marks on his chest, realizing he had been fed upon. Panic set in, and he desperately searched for a way out of the castle. But every door leading outside was locked. Determined, Thomas ventured deeper into the dark corridors of the castle. Eventually, he found his way to a lower chamber, where he discovered Orlok sleeping inside a coffin. Seizing the opportunity, Thomas grabbed an axe and attempted to strike the vampire down. However, before he could deliver the fatal blow, Orlok suddenly awakened and stopped him. Terrified, Thomas fled. Meanwhile, Orlok began chanting an incantation while holding Ellen's hair. As the ritual progressed, Ellen, in another realm, felt its effects and began to succumb to the dark force taking hold of her. Suddenly, Thomas found himself compelled by Orlok to unlock the door he had secured earlier. His body froze, he couldn't move a muscle. Orlok's influence was overwhelming. Then, in a ruthless frenzy, the vampire attacked, feeding on him without mercy. Meanwhile, back in Wisborg, Ellen suffered from a mysterious ailment. Concerned, Friedrich called Dr. Wilhelm to examine her. As her condition worsened, Ellen began moaning as if in a trance, lost in something beyond the physical realm. Disturbed by this, Wilhelm sedated her immediately. Back at the castle, Thomas jolted awake in sheer terror. With no time to waste, he rushed to escape, throwing himself out of the window. Unfortunately, he plummeted into an unknown river, vanishing beneath the waters. Ellen's condition deteriorated rapidly, seizures racked her body, and Dr. Wilhelm struggled to keep her stable. Desperate for answers, he confided in Friedrich, warning him that something far more sinister was at play. "The devil is near," he muttered. Elsewhere, deep in the forest, a nun gathered firewood when she stumbled upon Thomas's lifeless body on the riverbank. Acting quickly, she carried him to a church, where she and the other nuns prayed over him. Slowly, Thomas regained consciousness. Though they urged him to rest and recover, he refused. "I must return to Wisborg," he insisted. "Ellen is in danger." At the same time, Orlok had begun his journey to Wisborg, traveling by ship with a coffin filled with grave dirt and plague-infested rats. Dr. Wilhelm and Friedrich sought help from Albin Eberhard von Franz, an ostracized scientist in Switzerland known for his occult research. Upon hearing of Ellen's condition, Albin immediately recognized the cause. She was under the spell of a Nosferatu, a demonic, plague-bearing vampire. Determined to uncover the truth, Albin challenged the entity to reveal itself. Suddenly, Ellen became possessed, her body convulsing as Orlok spoke through her. Her screams filled the room. Albin turned to Friedrich. "Ellen is cursed," he declared. Dr. Wilhelm, however, remained skeptical. "She's just delusional," he insisted, though Friedrich suspected her suffering was tied to Thomas's absence. "I need to study this demon further," Albin said before leaving. He instructed Anna to watch over Ellen closely and summon him if anything changed. Meanwhile, Thomas finally returned to Wisborg. As soon as he spoke to Ellen, affirming that her nightmares were real, he collapsed into unconsciousness. That night, guards arrived at Friedrich's home with grim news. A ghostly ship had wrecked upon Wisborg's shore, Orlok's vessel. With it came a swarm of plague-infested rats, marking the beginning of an unholy pandemic. Orlok, now in Wisborg, reunited with his devoted servant, Nock. Bowing before his master, Nock grinned as Orlok proclaimed, "This land shall know dread and despair." By morning, the streets of Wisborg fell into chaos. The plague spread rapidly, claiming lives. As the city descended into fear, Ellen remained by Thomas's side, watching over him as he lay gravely ill. Anna entered the room, apologizing for dismissing Ellen's warnings. "I should have listened," she whispered. Meanwhile, Dr. Wilhelm and Albin examined the bodies retrieved from Orlok's wrecked ship. What they discovered was far more horrifying than any ordinary plague. The rats themselves were demonic. Albin demanded to see Nock, but the man had already escaped. "We must find him at all costs," Albin urged. "This is no mere disease. This is a curse." That night, Orlok chanted a dark incantation, calling forth a deeper darkness upon the land. At the same time, Thomas, feverish and weak, thrashed in his sleep. He suddenly jolted awake, gasping. In his vision, Orlok had spoken to him. Downstairs, Anna felt a creeping sensation of being watched. When she turned, she was startled to see Ellen, her eyes vacant, pleading softly, "Stay with me tonight." Meanwhile, in his study, Albin made a chilling revelation. Wisborg was facing the undead plague-bearer, Nosferatu. That night, Ellen woke into a nightmare. As she opened her eyes, she came face to face with him. A shadow loomed over her. A voice, ancient and chilling, whispered, "You are not of humankind. I have been lying in the deepest darkness, and you, my dear, have awakened me." Orlok tried once more to deceive Ellen, claiming that Thomas had willingly signed their divorce papers in exchange for mere gold. But Ellen was not so easily fooled. She saw through his lies. When she refused to submit to his will, Orlok threatened to take Thomas's life. Upon waking, Ellen was met with a horrifying sight. Orlok's plague-infested rats had already feasted on Anna. She let out a scream of shock and grief. The epidemic had spread like wildfire, forcing the entire city of Wisborg into quarantine. Anna, barely clinging to life, began exhibiting symptoms of the plague. Friedrich stayed by her side, offering comfort in her final moments. Afterward, he left the room to speak with Ellen. Still struggling to believe that a demon was behind all of this, he instead blamed Ellen and Thomas, suspecting them as the source of the infection. He demanded they leave Wisborg at once. Furious at his ignorance, Ellen stormed away. Meanwhile, in Knock's abandoned office, Albin discovered an ancient insignia etched into the wall, one that had long foretold the coming of the Fordu. Ellen and Thomas returned home, but their reunion was far from peaceful. Thomas, desperate, begged his wife to leave the cursed city with him. But Ellen, now burdened by dark truths, told him it was no longer possible. She finally confessed her secret. Long before she married Thomas, she had summoned the devil himself. They had been lovers in the shadows, bound together until her marriage severed their connection. Her words rattled Thomas. He then confronted her about the documents he had supposedly signed in exchange for money. Their argument grew heated, but before Ellen could explain, she began convulsing violently. Her body stiffened, and her voice turned unnatural. She had been possessed by the Nosferatu. Realizing the horror unfolding before him, Thomas attempted to flee for help. But Ellen, now controlled by the entity, warned him not to leave. Then, with an eerie command, she ordered him to lay with her. Unable to resist the force compelling him, he obeyed. When it was over, Ellen collapsed, regaining consciousness as if waking from a terrible dream. That night, Orlok made his presence known once more. In a ruthless display of power, he slaughtered Friedrich's children, leaving the man utterly broken. As he buried his family, grief consumed him, and he could no longer deny the truth: Nosferatu was real. Von Franz, seeing no other way, proposed an expedition to finally end Orlok's reign. He, Dr. Wilhelm, and Thomas would locate the vampire's resting place and destroy him. From his years of occult research, von Franz had learned that Nosferatu could only be truly vanquished through the willing sacrifice of a fair maiden. Ellen was the only one who fit the role. Friedrich, drowning in madness and despair, succumbed to an unspeakable act. He defiled his wife's corpse before succumbing to the plague himself. By the time the others arrived, he was already dead. With no choice, his body and those of his family were set ablaze. Determined to see their mission through, the expedition continued. Meanwhile, Ellen, fully aware of her fate, physically summoned Orlok to her chambers. At last, the crew located Orlok's resting place. Thomas approached the coffin cautiously, blade in hand. With a deep breath, he lifted the lid and plunged the weapon downward. But as the blood seeped out, horror dawned upon them. Orlok was nowhere to be found. Lying in the coffin, grinning with bloodied teeth, was Knock. The moment Thomas realized the expedition was nothing but a diversion, he ran back to save Ellen. Meanwhile, von Franz whispered ancient prayers before setting the crypt ablaze, ensuring no remnants of Orlok's unholy presence remained. Back at the manor, Orlok finally arrived to claim his bride. Ellen stood there waiting, draped in her bridal attire. With unwavering resolve, she accepted the dark vows he recited. As the ritual was completed, she surrendered fully, allowing him to feast upon her while they consummated their unholy union. But as dawn broke, Orlok felt something was amiss. A strange weakness crept through his body. His form began to wither, his immortal flesh turning to dust. He let out a tormented scream as his existence unraveled, collapsing into a lifeless husk in Ellen's arms. Moments later, Thomas arrived, breathless, only to find Ellen fading away. She gazed at him weakly, her final moments slipping through trembling fingers. He knelt beside her, grasping her hand tightly as she whispered her last breath. With her sacrifice, the plague ended. The darkness that had consumed Wisborg was no more. And then, silence. The nightmare was over. The screen fades to black. So that's the end of our movie. If you've come this far, make sure to give a thumbs up and subscribe my channel. See you later.